Yeah, this guy hasn't been on for a while. And you're going to love this guy. He's going to answer questions that you've been wanting to have answered for a long time because he knows a little something about cholesterol. As a matter of fact, apparently he knows more than the people over at the ADA or the AHA. I think they know a lot about cholesterol, but they won't tell you the truth. He knows more. Well, the statin companies know the truth, but they won't tell you the truth because if they told you the truth, you wouldn't be taking their product. This guy was in my first two movies, and he's been on the show several times over the years. I've actually met this guy in person several times. So impressed with him that I introduced him to my buddy, Dr. Drew, and then Dr. Drew fell in love with this guy. So he's just out there everywhere, and everyone who meets him, they go, "Oh my God, that guy knows his shit." I'm talking about Mr. Dave Feldman. How you doing, man?
I'm good. That's a very generous opening. Thank you.
But it's the truth. I mean, look, Drew does not suffer fools. And I'll never forget the first time you've been on Drew a few times now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The first time I said, Drew, I got this guy you got to meet. And he was like, well, why don't you come on with him? I was like, Drew, you don't know. He goes, if you want him on, you got to come on with him. You remember that time? It was like the first time we
I
went.
do.
Because
Yeah, that was fun.
Drew does not like to run out of shit to say. And he needs someone there with him to pick up the slack in case you, and so he didn't know you, he didn't trust you. So he goes, you're coming in with this guy. If he doesn't talk, you and I are going to have something to talk about. I sat there like it was a tennis match because all I basically said was, Drew, here's Dave, Drew. And you guys just volleyed back and forth. And my head was just going back and forth. I had nothing to say for the whole show. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, you actually had a lot of great quips that you fit in here and there, but it's true. Dr. Drew and I mean, we really kind of got pretty deep into some biochemistry. It was actually a lot of fun. Uh, but you're right. It was a really great experience. Really enjoyed chatting with him. He really has a breadth and a range of different things that he gets into.
You kind of like our other friend Ivor Cummins, you guys started looking at cholesterol, statins, all this kind of stuff way back when. We know Ivor's story. I can't remember who came first, chicken or the egg. Who came first? You or Ivor? Who's putting stuff out there first?
Well, I think Ivor Cummins, I mean, I started my journey effectively at the end of November of 2015, and I think Ivor Cummins had a video called "The Cholesterol Conundrum." I think that
Yeah.
was probably one of his most viral videos, and I remember seeing that at the time. So I'm pretty confident uh, if there's a who came first, it'd be Ivor Cummins, at least with the early cholesterol interest. Um,
Right. But neither of you guys, and I want the audience to be very clear on this, neither of you guys came directly from a medical background. Explain who you are and and what you did before you did this.
Yes, well, I mean, my entire life I've been an engineer, particularly in software platform development, especially architecture. And so I've just lived my life in code. I've really had very little interest in medicine, nutrition, certainly not, biochemistry to any breadth or degree. And a lot of that really didn't happen until I got my first cholesterol test after going on a ketogenic diet, and it had skyrocketed. That's what activated my interest.
Okay, so let's talk about that because that happens to some people, not everyone, but cholesterol can and will go up when you start doing a low carb diet for some people. Other people, it actually goes down. Can you explain what happens?
Yes, and actually, just to kind of save people the time who may have already heard of me or my work from your prior podcasts, since then, we actually have several papers published. So you can actually go to cholesterolcode.com/papers. We literally have it published. What I was starting to work out back at that time. So here's, I guess, what I would say is the elevator pitch of what I think happened to me And what I think happens to other people is most people who are going on a low carb diet, they are typically more of the people who feel they should. You know, they're very overweight and they feel that a diet's going to help their health. And a lot of times that's exactly what happens. But only more recently, only really in like the last 5-10 years, have there been people who are already more metabolically fit or not coming from a more challenged state who adopt the diet. And unintuitively, those folks, often leaner or fitter folks, are the ones who see the most pronounced increase in their LDL cholesterol. And like me, they get shocked and like, wait a sec, why did this happen to me? And it didn't happen to my friends who are, you know, using this diet to get over, to lose weight and so forth. And so the model that I've worked out over the last 6-7 years, which, you know, we're still testing, but so far seems to be holding up really well, is that the reason for this is when you're metabolically healthy, you're very good at handling the fuel in your body. If you're fueled more by fat, that's kind of important because to move fat around in your bloodstream, your blood is water-based. And therefore you need carriers. You need these proteins that move them around. And that includes a very famous protein you've heard of called ApoB.
Mm-hmm.
And that also carries cholesterol. So cholesterol, I like to say, ride shares with the fat you're fueled by on a low carb, high fat diet on these ApoB carriers.
Okay. And there's also there's ApoA. Explain ApoA versus ApoB and how they differ. And then and by the way, I like the way you explain things, Dave. You don't get into the weeds. Keep doing what you're doing. Ride share, that kind of stuff. Keep it on that level.
Yeah, well, yes. And it's interesting that you would know about ApoA because ApoA-1 is the other major protein of something else that's famous for us, which is HDL. You often hear about HDL being the quote unquote good cholesterol. So I'm going to try not to get too technical, but ApoA-1, you could kind of think of as the counterpart to ApoB. And here's an easy way of thinking of it. ApoB is the protein that's supposed to start out loaded up. It's loaded up with all these lipids your cells need, not just the fats you're fueled by, but also fast soluble vitamins and so forth. It's just like this giant tanker of the stuff your body needs. It's supposed to start big, but as it drops off its cargo, it gets small. But conversely, while it's getting smaller, it's shedding pieces of itself. And ApoA-1 is kind of the major counterpart protein to it that's on this other kind of boat, these HDL. And they're picking up a lot of what's getting shed. And that's why the cholesterol found in ApoA-1, which is HDL, that's why HDL cholesterol tends to be a good marker because it seems to suggest that there's a success in the dropping off of stuff, right? So kind of taking this back to, you know, on your podcast, I'm sure the word metabolism gets, you know, talked about a lot, right?
It's bandied about.
But yeah, but at its core, it's worth kind of breaking down to its basics. It's this balance between anabolism, which is the building up of stuff, and catabolism, which is the breaking down of stuff. And usually what we mean is with regard to fuel. So how much are you metabolizing fuel? Kind of what we're really saying is how successful are you at balancing the taking in and putting back of fuel? And that's very relevant for these folks, including folks like me, who if I'm more metabolically healthy, how well can I utilize these proteins in their giving and taking? Because those ApoB, they need to be successful at dropping off all of these lipids that my body needs. And HDL kind of becomes a marker, right? Like you find people who are metabolically healthy, their HDL is higher, whatever diet they're on, whether they're on a fat-based diet or you know, carb-based diet. That signals successful interaction of the dropping off of those lipids and for them to pick up the difference. And then that brings me to the last part of the triad, which I know you hear me say all the time, these three parts, which is triglycerides are part of that cargo. So when you get a blood test and it's got not just your LDL cholesterol and your HDL cholesterol, you hear about triglycerides. Triglycerides are that fat-based fuel. And it's maybe a little unintuitive that I would say lower is better when I'm saying you're being powered by it, but it's really just a measure of how successful it is at delivering it, right? If you see a bunch of trucks stuck on the road with a bunch of cargo in them, that's not a good sign. But if you're seeing a lot of empty trucks because they're successful at dropping them off and restocking wherever they're taking it, that is a good sign, right?
Right. Okay. Now that we have all of that, that's a good kicking off point. I do these phone calls 5 days a week. I would be crazy if I didn't say at least 40%, well over 1/3, would say, the cholesterol. Well, the cholesterol question always comes up, but some people, that's the whole phone call. That's it's like, hey, I went to my doctor, and my doctor says my cholesterol is crazy high, and I need to be on a statin. And I'll tell you what I tell them, and then you could tell me what you would tell them. I'll go first. First, I tell them I'm not a doctor and I can't give actual medical advice, but I'll ask them what the total cholesterol is, and they'll usually have that number at the ready. The number could be anywhere from 170 to, I'll see as high as 300, something like that. Sometimes north of 300, but usually let's call it 230, 240 to be anywhere in the range of an average. And then I'll say, hey, you happen to have your LDLs there? Oh, yeah, my LDLs were this. Oh, great. Where were your HDLs? My HDLs were that. Okay, what's your ratio number? Well, my doctor told me my ratio number was pretty good. I'll go, okay, great. And they'll tell me that number, right? Somewhere between 3 and 6. And any of this sounded familiar, Dave, so far?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And then I'll say, so tell me about your ApoB and your small dense particles. And they'll go, no, I don't have that here. It's like, well, you must have it there. What was your calcium score? Well, we didn't do that. Did you take a CT scan on top of the calcium score? No CT scan. And your doctor's recommending what again? Well, he says I need to be on the statin like right away. He wants me to be on the statin today. And I go, okay. And that's when I'll say my famous line. Does he want you to masturbate with a condom on also? Because that's what we're doing here. See, you use trucks on the highway. I do masturbation and condoms. And they'll say, well, what are you talking about? And I'll say, he's asking you to masturbate with a condom on. Would you do that? And they will go, no, I wouldn't do that. It's like, why not? It's like, well, can't get anyone pregnant when you're masturbating. It's like, right. You also can't get heart disease unless you know what the markers are. And you haven't told me anything yet. I'm not a doctor, but I haven't heard any numbers there that would tell me to tell you, you need to go see someone else. So I tell them, you need to go back to your doctor and tell them that you want a particle size test. You want to check ApoA and ApoB. You want a CAC score and a CT scan. And they'll say, well, my doctor says he doesn't check all that. Like, well, in that case, you need to go find a new doctor. How is it a kid that grew up on a fucking bayou know this? How is it that a software guy knows this? Yet a guy with a medical degree is making someone take a pill with known side effects. Known side effects. What say you, Dave? Am I wrong, by the way?
Well, so of course, I'm in general always trying to be very neutral with regard to people's relationship with their doctor, and same as you. I don't provide medical advice. I'm always emphasizing that to people. This isn't medical advice, and in particular, I'm always careful to discuss as little as possible cholesterol-lowering medication per se. Right? To me, it's kind of the cart when the horse is. Look, is the high LDL causing the atherosclerosis independently? Right? And the thing you mentioned that I really want to zero in on that I think is really valuable to discuss is a CAC. A CAC, for people who don't know, it's a coronary artery calcification score. And most people can typically just get it on their own. They can often, there's a lot of facilities that provide this, direct to patient. A lot of times you can get it from anywhere from like $50 to like a couple $100. And I have to tell you, since we last talked, I mean, the emerging research, especially recently, there's a Denmark study out of last year that had 23,000 patients, and it had comparison of the CAC with CT angiography, which captures both calcification and soft plaque, which is what we're using in a study, which we'll talk about in a moment. But it found that there's such an extraordinarily close correlation with CAC that even though the CT angiogram is kind of the bigger guns and usually can capture the soft plaque that might not get captured by the CAC, prognostically, they both were very close together in that if you had a positive CAC, which is to say above a zero, it already could tell you so much about where your heart disease really stood and what the likelihood is that you had future events. But you're exactly right, Vinnie, in that what is better of a measurement than the actual disease itself? Like, that's one of the things that I am fascinated by, is that this technology has been around for almost 30 years. And this has already had a lot of enormous data behind it before this point, but it only seems to be growing stronger. I am surprised that there's not more interest and emphasis on this in particular. Wherever you stand on LDL cholesterol in particular, if you look at the data, it's quite compelling that looking at the actual disease itself will tell you more about the likelihood of your potential trouble and whether you should be taking further steps to change, how that outcome would occur.
So and by the way, folks, a CAC score is non-invasive. You just get under the machine, and the CT scan, they actually have to pump a dye in you. That's why,
Right.
they can look right into every artery, right? I mean, it basically goes throughout your heart, and they can see where anything is. And as Dave said, soft plaque as well as, the hard plaque and what have you. The question becomes, when should someone consider a statin, or do we even know? I mean, because statins don't reverse any of this, right? I mean, that's not the job of a statin. Give me the definition of what a statin is supposed to do.
Well, again, I'll be a bit delicate, but of certainly what it's known for is it helps to conventional language, I'm going to say, block a part of a pathway. There's a pathway in the synthesis of cholesterol, and in blocking it, it removes the amount of cholesterol production, and this has a downstream effect of both less that's leaving the liver and more that's getting absorbed by the liver, because it's creating more demand in the liver to absorb it. So there's actually more receptors that take in the LDL, and therefore there's just like less remaining in the vasculature, right? And in that regard, to be fair, even for as much as I kind of generally don't look into cholesterol-lowering medication research in particular, furthermore, I actually don't even look that much into secondary prevention, which is those folks who've already had kind of an event, where many, even low-carb doctors who are more comfortable with primary prevention, which is to say somebody who hasn't already had a heart attack with higher LDL, might say, well, in the case of secondary prevention, the data is a bit stronger. But again, this isn't really so much my forte. That's still the cart, right? For me, the horse is, look, this is what kind of led me around to where I'm at today, because as you know, Vinny, my cholesterol went through the roof. And what is considered foundational to the lipid hypothesis is that folks with a disease known as homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, I know it's a mouthful, but it's a disease where there's an extremely severe limitation to how much it can bind to those LDL particles and pull them out of the bloodstream, in which there's an association with very early heart disease. Nobel laureates Brown and Goldstein 50 years ago, like half a century ago, were looking at children who were born with this disease, and they would develop angina at, like, say, age 3,
Wow.
and then would have a heart attack at age 6. It's heartbreaking, right? And that's why this became very meaningful to me very early on, because even as I'm kind of like exploring how I had high LDL and trying to understand it, And I'm saying the things I just told you now, as far as back in those days, I was like, this seems a lot more like a network. My LDL, it got up to around, I want to say 250, 260.
Just the LDL.
There's just the LDL, right? But I know you've already had this guest on before, Nicole Racine, right? She, back then, as I'm like reporting this on my, at that time, new blog, cholesterolcode.com, she starts commenting back to me that she has LDL around 600 or 700 LDL, around these like heightened levels. Well, immediately I'm thinking of Brown and Goldstein. These, I mean, that's where these children were at. We're at those levels. So she has homozygous FH levels, right? And naturally, we're wondering, is she going to exhibit the same signs? Is she going to show tendon xanthomas like you would find? Is she likewise going to develop rapid atherosclerosis? And she's, registered nurse. So certainly she has access to all of these, this equipment to track and find out for herself. And she had other reasons for why, she needed to maintain this path. I don't know if she shared this with you, but actually she even had a coronary artery calcification score recently. I think it was like maybe a year or two ago or something along those lines. And it came back 0. I don't want to say that, this one anecdote should be something everybody should act from.
Right.
But I will say that this is the early stages of where you're trying to find these distinctions. Because what this comes down to, Vinny, is up until now, and I just gave a talk on this at Low Carb Denver, up until now, we've not had the opportunity scientifically to look at folks who have a high LDL in what I would term presumably a functional lipid metabolism. Virtually all studies we have in which LDL associates with atherosclerosis either has a portion of the population or exclusively focuses on a population that has some severe form of dysfunctional lipid metabolism, either from a disease they're born with, like the homozygous FH that I just mentioned, or something they acquire, like metabolic syndrome. And so until we can disentangle where the LDL may be downstream of that dysfunction, then we couldn't really study it that easily. And that's where, interestingly, this low carb diet having this response gave us the scientific opportunity. Except, as you know, the beginning of my story was I was knocking on lipidologists' doors and saying, hey, let's study these folks, because this, that's what you want in an experiment. Right. You want the one variable of interest to be isolated from the things you already know associate with the outcome that you want to get a clean signal with, right? And it just wasn't working. So I gave up in 2019 and started our own study to make it happen.
Oh, mouthful. We're going to come right back, folks. But first, I have to tell you about Villa Cappelli olive oil, the olive oil company that's been sponsoring this podcast almost from the beginning. Right before I got on the mic, I keep a little shot glass right on my counter. And that shot glass is there to remind me to pour a shot of olive oil every day into that glass. I take a little salt. I have that Malden salt, a real nice flaky salt, and I'll just put just a couple of crumbles in there. It's like having my own little drinkable salad caprese. Man, that Villa Cappelli, look, in this country, in the United States, you can cut olive oil up to 40% and still call it 100% pure olive oil. That's a crime, because the other 40%, I'm sure Dave would tell you, seed oils, probably not that healthy for you. Villa Cappelli is guaranteed 100% pure olive oil from Italy, from Puglia. I know the owner of the company. I knew the owners, but one of them passed away. Couldn't get him to stop smoking cigarettes, and Paul Cappelli is no longer with us. Great man, started a great company, but Paul's husband, Stephen Crutchfield, is still running that company, and it spins like a top. Let them know we sent you. Put in promo code Vinnie, VINNIE, to get 10% off every single time at Villa Cappelli. Promo code Vinnie, VINNIE, no wimpy Y, and you'll get 10% off every time at Villa Cappelli olive oil. Let them know we sent you. I drink it like water. You should too. People always say to me, hey, besides your vitamins, which other supplements should I take? and I'll say olive oil, and they'll go, "Oh yeah. Well, I say, no, that's a supplement. Take it; it's good for you." Villa Cappelli. What do you think about that, Dave? Let's go off subject for just a second. Olive oil as a supplement. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I'll concede on the nutrition front. I'm
Yeah.
not as versed. I will say that I do think there is some concern at a high threshold of things like seed oils.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's also a dose makes the poison. But I will say that there was an experiment that I did not too long ago. I want to say, I guess it was 3 years ago, where I did try to interventionally have butter as a base for a product known as keto chow. You can basically determine what, fat base you had, butter versus olive oil. And the olive oil I got was, I think it's Kirkland, which I think comes from Costco.
Right. It's Costco brand. Yeah.
And the experiment failed because I couldn't stomach it. It was I could hardly stand it. And even though it had fairly good ratings online, I later was talking to somebody who had done lab tests against lots of different brands, but Kirkland was one of them. And he basically said just what you just now said in your ad. I probably should have just talked to you first, is that unfortunately, you really can claim 100% purity when it's not, in fact, that you're exactly right. How I don't even know how that's possible. How you can just make these claims. It actually makes me think of protein. I don't know if you knew this also, but on labels where they're labeling protein,
Mm-hmm.
it's actually based on an equation against nitrogen. It's not actually confirmed to be amino acid composed proteins, which likewise I think is just fraudulent because it's just like it's literally definitionally what proteins are, is they are amino acids, right?
Yeah.
Or a composite, a complex of amino acids.
Right.
Anyway, that's the problem.
It
It's
drives
kind of
me nuts. And I've been yelling this for years. And look, 15 years ago, back when I did my radio show in the 80s, people just say, "Oh, he's wearing a tinfoil hat. He's saying the government is in on this stuff." But these companies, and I would say it back then, and I'll still say it, when ConAgra and all these big giant companies, that's how these senators make their money, right? They get money from these, big food and big drugs. And, we know that, right? Look, I hate to go off into the weeds here, but I always tell people, it's like, okay, the Democrats, they hate guns, or they say they hate guns, right? Yeah. Why is it not one gun law gets changed when the Democrats are in power? People go, it's interesting. No, they change it. No, they'll say they change. It's like, no. They'll make a few laws here and there, California and this and that and the whole thing. By and large, not one law changes about how you can purchase a gun in the United States, even when the Democrats are in power. Would you like to know why? It's because they're taking as much money from the NRA as the right is taking from the NRA. I don't talk about politics on this show, but I'll talk about this, right? The same thing happens with food, right? And drugs. They take the lobbyists give just as much money to the right as they do to the left. And this has been going on for years. That's why what happens. They're not looking at our best interest. They're looking at their best interest, right? That's why you can cut olive oil or avocado oil, for that matter, up to 40% and still put 100% pure olive oil or avocado oil right on the package. And by the way, I'm not doing an ad anymore, folks. I'm just telling you the reality. And Dave was just talking about how they figure out, proteins based on a nitrogen test. This is what goes on. And we think that they have our best interest in mind, but they don't. This is what happens. That's why we have the Daves of the world that come in and give us the real knowledge. So thank you, sir, for doing that.
I'll add just one more thing. If you ever get avocado oil, or like, for example, I've tried to get avocado oil based mayo for making some deviled eggs. Check I've seen many brands that its first ingredient is canola oil, and
Right.
avocado oil is like its third or fourth, right?
Right.
Like it really is surprising that it's not at least a requirement it be the predominant, the plurality. But what do you do?
Look, I
Anyway,
mean,
sorry.
you go to a restaurant, I could do this all night. You go to a restaurant and you get, I would never order fries, but I was in a restaurant one night and everybody was getting truffle fries. And it's like, wait a minute. Are those truffle fries the same prices? Oh, yeah, you could trade them out. You have the regular fries or the truffle fries. And I was like, well, you realize there's no real truffle on that, right? I was like, no, they're truffle fries. So it's like, no, truffles are like the price of cocaine or gold. The price would have to be increased by some amount, some nominal amount. You can't say, oh, just bring me the truffle fries, right? You might have something that tastes like truffle, but it ain't truffles, right? So you could just make up shit as you go and just sell it, and people go, okay, yeah, it's truffle fries. No, it's not. It's just seed oils that taste like something else. And I could go on and on and on about that, but that's the world we live in. You have to, I tell everyone, you have to advocate for yourself or you end up with problems. But,
This is where engineers like me get in trouble because we're so literal. We
yeah.
expect words to have their actual literal meaning.
Yeah,
I,
look, same here. I mean, and I'm not even, I'm not where you guys are, but I grew up in that scientific world where there's as I would always say, there was a universal truth to everything, right? Yeah, you can squint your eyes and make anything look like something else, but there's a universal truth. That's why your liver is a meritocracy. It's not going to lie. Whatever you give it, it's going to give back. I talk to people all the time that tell me, I'm going off the page here for a second, but they'll say, look, man, NSNG was working for me and then it stopped. Why? It's like, because you're doing something different. It's like, no, I'm not doing anything different. I'm doing exactly the same thing. And when I start interviewing them, and I'll just sit there and think the way their liver's thinking from what their liver's seeing all day long. It turns out they're not doing what they were doing before, right? But they can't see it because we lie to ourselves, not on purpose, but we do it. As humans, we squint and we make things seem like. Would you agree?
I, yeah, not only do I agree, I think this is a big problem with science in general. I think a lot of the issues that we have with science, including where I'm working in with lipids and so forth, a lot of times I think where people are assuming there's corruption, it's really just motivated reasoning. And because this is just human, and we see this with diet, just like you were describing, that the people you're talking to aren't overtly lying to you. They
Right.
genuinely believe that they're still adhering. I deal with this with my family all the time, where some of them militantly go into low carb and then they relax some standards, but from their perspective, they haven't, or the amount that they're cheating is really much lower than it was, such that it hardly even counts. They establish new habits that they're not even realizing are as pervasive as they thought that it was. And again, it's fine, whatever you're willing to take on and accept as your choices, that works. It's just, don't get caught up in deceiving yourself. Own your choices, right? Make sure that if you're the one who's going to step off of your diet, or if you're the one who's going to rely a lot on, I get a lot of flack online because I can kind of sometimes be a bit of more of a purist on the data. I don't like a lot of modeling and adjusted data. At least show us what the baseline data was before you start pulling the levers on it, right? But in the world we're in, especially in science, especially in nutrition, there is so much that's built from models. And that can be kind of a problem
Wait,
if
Dave, you're not talking to me. You're talking to an audience. Explain
that's true.
talk about the model and how, do it. I'm in third grade. Explain how models work and why they might not be as accurate as you need them to be.
Sure. So let me give you probably one of the more prominent examples. Let's say that we want to determine how much a given food type is pathogenic, as in it's causing disease, right? It's bad for you. And I say, oh, well, as it turns out, this particular food seems to associate more with everybody who's consuming it with heart disease, right? Notice I'm not even naming what that food is. But whatever that food type is, as it turns out, a lot of the people who consume that food type tend to also have bad habits. And that's because they're told over and over again, that's not a good food type to consume. So they also happen to smoke a bit more. They tend to not work out as much. Whereas the other group of people who consume less of it, it's because they're adhering to what they're told is not good about it. And there's a problem here because it could be that the food that they're being told is not good for you actually is fine for you or even healthy for you. But the corresponding habits of that type of person can counterbalance it. And so what I'm describing is called a healthy user bias, which is people who are already health conscious are going to be doing a cluster of different things. And that makes it harder to get that signal out, which is similar to what I was talking about earlier with LDL. And the reason this is an issue is because until you really do isolate out health conscious people who are consuming that kind of food, you can't really know for sure. But the problem is we do have a lot of researchers that say you can using statistics. With statistics, even without truly getting those people who are health conscious and consuming that type of food, we can do what's called sensitivity analyses. And what that means basically is that they're determining how much of these other different things, like how much smoking matters, how much exercise matters, and from that model what they believe the data would have been. But the challenge, Vinny, is that this is all still theoretical. It's theoretical until you actually have folks who are consuming that kind of food. So for example, in our study, I know, or let me put it this way, I can confidently speculate that a lot of the folks in our study, which I realize I haven't given the full introduction yet, they not only have high LDL, but part of how they have high LDL is they're on a diet similar to what I'm on and probably similar to what you're on, which has a large amount of foods that were recommended against eating. And so I'm very curious as to how much the foods that they're typically eating that they're recommended against eating are going to associate with disease when I know so many of these folks are in fact health conscious by, statistical likelihood. That's what it looks like. And until this had happened, we were always going to be in trouble because all of these recommendations are ultimately built a lot on these models. I shouldn't say all. I mean, certainly there are some RCTs and so forth that are dietarily related. But when something's built entirely on epidemiology, entirely on observational data, it can be a challenge to truly count on your models being reflective of reality. And frankly, like I said, this is where I get in a lot of trouble. I'm just really skeptical. I'm skeptical of anything for which there's model data when I don't get a chance to see it in real life.
Yeah, I was talking about this in my Instagram just a couple of days ago. I saw a study. I'm trying to remember because I do so many damn Instagrams, but it was I saw a study where they're showing that as we age, there's muscle mass has more to do with not developing coronary disease than if you were morbidly obese. And I thought about that for a minute, and then I didn't even read the abstract. I just went, they took 6,200 people, and I went, okay, so now we're talking epidemiology. And I said, of course they're going to come up with this because the people with more muscle mass are the people who are actually going to a gym and working out and probably eating right. And, because when you get older, it's even more important not to get sarcopenia. You have to eat extra protein and work out extra hard. You're going to have extra muscle on you. And now they're correlating that with, they're going, oh, muscle matters more than if you're morbidly obese. What does that tell the morbidly obese person? Oh, I'm doing perfectly fine over here, right? No, you're not. You're not. It's not talking to the people who are doing the right thing. They just told the people doing the wrong thing, keep doing it. It makes no sense to go, oh, no, muscle matters. I'm just morbidly obese. You don't get sick from that. That's not what the study was trying to say. But that's what the headline said, and nobody went past the headline. And I barely went past the headline to do my dissertation of this is bullshit. What say you?
No, it's exactly right. That's probably one of my favorite kinds of examples, because certainly I do think an ongoing, emphasis on health and maintaining muscle mass likely has an impact on longevity. But that said, it's a hypothesis. Like until we really could actually have people that we randomize at, say, age 60 and say, okay, you guys, you're going to go ahead and go on to these routines, and we're going to need you to do this for 20 years.
Yeah.
And you other guys, we don't want you. We want you to stay sedentary, watch more Netflix, that kind of thing. Naturally, a lot of scientists hearing me right now are going to go, nobody's going to ever pay for that. No one's ever going to do that.
Right.
And I think that's okay. It's okay to just admit when we can't know something very well, right? It's okay to go by Bradford Hill criteria. Bradford Hill was often called the father of epidemiology. And he had these assessments, and these assessments kind of gave you a sense of how strong the level of epidemiology is, to where you could get a sense of how truly causal something is. But even he had these assessments to where they weren't a pass or fail. They were like, just how strong do each of these levers go to give you that degree of confidence before you can really get to something like a true RCT, which, by the way, is also flawed, right?
Yeah.
But at least is stronger, because with an RCT, and hopefully your audience knows, but I mean randomized control trial, what you're doing is you're trying to remove the confounders you don't know about. That's the idea. Is we know there's a lot of confounders you may not be aware of. And so with randomizing who's in the intervention and who's in the control, you're saying, well, we don't need to know a lot of those things. Whereas these models that I was kind of talking about before, they seek to identify them and then extrapolate from them. And another place where I'm just very vocal is I get frustrated by how much of our data exists on sick populations that we extrapolate to healthy populations. Like we try to determine, what the appropriate reference ranges are for blood work from populations we know may be more compromised. I say, let's get more healthy population data, particularly long-term longitudinal data. I think that's more important.
But you see, now you're talking about healthcare, and everybody's more interested in sick care, and the standard of health nowadays. I mean, it's all crazy. I could go off in the weeds with you all day. I want to get back to the heart just a bit, because that's why we have you on. And I do have a question. I'm going to write my question down because I do not want to forget to ask, but I want you to go back into, and I know you can't talk about these studies that you guys are in the middle of doing right now, but can you give us anything? Because you have some pretty exciting stuff right now going on, right?
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I can talk plenty about the studies. It's just what we kind of talked about before this, before we aired, is that there's a certain amount that I know that's going into a preliminary paper that's coming up soon. That's part of the news that I get to share with you now, which is that what happened is on February 8th, just a few weeks ago, we had all of the participants of the study that we're doing get their first scan. But let me take a step back and explain what this study is. So I mentioned that I myself saw my cholesterol go very high, particularly my total and LDL cholesterol. In the course of this journey where I worked out the model that I described earlier, I identified a phenotype typically called lean mass hyperresponders. And it's really just defined by three lipid values. People who have an LDL of 200 or higher, LDL of 200 or higher, people who have an HDL of 80 or higher, and who also have triglycerides of 70 or lower. Those three together. And for anybody who is not already familiar with the low carb space, just be aware that those three values that I just mentioned, they're already very rare individually in the general population. So the fact that they're all three coming together and that there's so many people who have this suggests a very new phenomenon. And it's kind of at the center of my research, because what I suspect but that again caveat is a hypothesis, is that these folks at a population level will actually not prove to be at high risk of cardiovascular disease, again, at a population level. But that would be counter to what I was just also describing with Brown and Goldstein, that they should instead, exhibit heart disease at a very early age because, or at least early into this process of getting into that phenotype, because if LDL and ApoB are independently causal towards developing atherosclerosis, well, then with this clean signal of just that being high, we would see that. But lean mass hyperresponders tend to be those folks who are metabolically healthy. So again, we have those other confounders that are separated out. HDL being high and triglycerides being low tend to associate with lower cardiovascular disease. But
say that again, because it's important.
Yes, HDL cholesterol and HDL cholesterol being high and triglycerides being low tend to associate with reduced cardiovascular disease.
Even in the absence of looking at LDL, total cholesterol.
Correct. And that's why I say whatever diet you're on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worth linking back to what I was saying before. I believe that it's not because HDL causes good stuff specifically and that triglycerides cause bad stuff specifically. I think that they're downstream, like they're more a reflection of how your metabolism is working, and that it's working probably well, than they are themselves causal agents. Does that make sense? Like,
it makes sense. And you're saying you believe, right? So we don't know what the truth is. And I don't think science in general knows what the truth is right now, right? Are there any other hypotheses out there where obviously we know what the other hypothesis is, but no one else is looking at triglycerides versus HDLs right now, are they?
Oh, they are. They tend to look at it as a ratio, but lipidology in general tends to want to look at these as individual components and determine how much each of them contribute to atherosclerosis, that buildup of plaque in the arteries, individually. Like, can we isolate what an ApoB's contribution is individually? And given how strong that belief is right now, these lean mass hyperresponders that I've described, who number in the thousands, right? We have thousands in our Facebook group that are bona fide. They should, at a population level, be developing atherosclerosis quite rapidly. And I don't say that flippantly, like I'm absolutely sure that they're not. That's part of why I've been so motivated to try to get together a study to find out prospectively if that is what's happening, if we do see that they're developing rapid atherosclerosis, right? And so that's what we did. I've crowdsourced a study because I couldn't get it through the typical means. I couldn't just there's no pharmaceutical company that wants to partner with me.
I think you were talking about this when we were at Low Carb Houston. You mentioned something to me in the hallway, and that was like 3 years ago, maybe 4 years.
Yeah.
You mentioned something to me. You see, I actually really do listen when people talk. And you're like, yeah, I'm going after this on my own. I'm like, that sounds fucking nutty, but okay.
Well, and I didn't know, it's funny. Houston was where I announced it. This was in 2019.
Yeah.
And when I went up there on that stage, Vinny, I had no clue whether I'd even get $500, much less 50,000. And I was asking for 50,000 at a minimum, figuring about 2,000 per participant, because I'm flying each of the participants to UCLA. That's where the research center is that's scanning them. And then flying them back twice, once for the first visit and then a second visit. And they're getting a CT angiogram on each visit so that we can look at what happened in the first one versus the second. And the main marker of interest is non-calcified plaque. We were talking about calcified versus non-calcified. Calcified is typically lifelong. There can be a lag to it, et cetera. Non-calcified, the soft plaque, that would be relevant if they're rapidly developing soft plaque, which is what the lipid hypothesis would posit, that at a population level, they should be, if the high LDL and high ApoB, which is prominent with lean mass hyperresponders, did in fact drive atherosclerosis on its own. And what I can tell you is what I've been cleared to release by the center, which is that actually now that we have all 100 of our participants scanned, we have their first scans, those first visits that I was just describing. The mean average age is 55, so well into middle age, which I hate to put it this way, but I kind of took comfort in that, because that means that we'd likely have more plaque at baseline. If we had a bunch of young folks, in their 20s, this study would have been kind of compromised, because then even, if they had high LDL, the question would be whether they could develop it that quickly. So they're at age 55, and given the existing lipid hypothesis, the expectation is they've already had 5 decades of accumulation, even at a moderate LDL, right? So there's that lifetime burden, as they would call it. We had a total time that they were at these levels of 4.4 years, which was also important news, because the eligibility was at least 2 years. So almost half a decade, and the mean average LDL, 260.
Wow.
That's the average LDL.
Folks, if you want to understand what a mean score is, you look at a bell curve. I'm sorry, I'm doing the kindergarten thing. The mean score is what's right at the top. It's basically an average thereof. Am I saying that correctly, Dave?
Yeah, basically, if you add all of the numbers together and divide it by the total number of numbers, then you'll get the mean average.
Right.
And I went and checked against NHANES data, which is got a big, large, U.S. population, and I had an NHANES data set ready anyway that had about 50,000 people in it, to just see how common that was, knowing it wasn't very common. And it was about 1 in 1,000 people
really
happen to have an LDL of 260 or higher. So these are folks in the top 10 of the top 1%, top 10% of the top 1% in the population, right? So absolute high exposure of LDL, and I'm confident high exposure of ApoB, because that's, again, typical of lean mass hyperresponders. But what happened to me, Vinnie, that I can share is, after we'd had all those scans on the 8th, on the 17th, Dr. Budoff, who's our principal investigator, got to present to me the very limited preliminary aggregate baseline data. I know it's a mouthful, but basically he got to show me the things I'm telling you right now,
right?
But also alongside what the plaque outcomes were. And first thing he showed me was the calcified plaque, just the large scale aggregates, which is, just like a very glossing, over of the large generalities. And it looks the closest, I can't say what the exact numbers are, but I can say it looks the closest to a 0 risk factor group. There's a big study called around what's known as the CAC Consortium. It's got like 66,000 people in it. And they do a stratification of different risk factor groups. So whether a group has 1 risk factor, has 2 risk factors, and what the stratification of calcification levels are in that group. And effectively, we were closest to the 0 risk factor group. So that is to say, there are some, which isn't surprising since we've got, people across the age range, including into the 60s and so forth. There are some with advanced CAC. There was like, I want to say 3, for example, with a 300 and above, right? Coronary calcification. But most of them had a 0 calcification, right? And I don't want to make that sound too extraordinary, because you want to always know what you compare it to.
Right.
And that's why I mentioned the CAC, if you're comparing it to the CAC. Now, this is very back of the envelope, but at the time Budoff is showing me this, immediately in my mind, because I pore over these studies all the time, I went, oh, okay. Our non-calcified, then, what he's about to show me, will look comparable. It'll probably look, we'll probably have some of those folks that are in the further end of the range of the higher CAC. That'll probably have moderate to severe plaque. And then the question is, once we do a match against Miami Heart, which is our other partner with Karam Nasir. He's another principal investigator, but he has a study that has not lean mass hyperresponders, but just regular people out of Miami that we're going to do matched controls with. It's kind of like our control group. That it'll probably look like, comparable to another zero risk factor group over there. Well, this is where I was completely stunned. The next thing that has to do with soft plaque, the thing that he showed me, uses a score called a total plaque score. And I'm going to unpack that for you real quick.
Okay.
I know this gets a little technical, but it's easy once you hear it.
I'm in second grade. Pretend I'm in second grade.
Second grade, right. So your coronary arteries, you hear the term a lot. What it is it's the arteries that surround the heart. And you've probably seen graphics of it many times. People who are hearing me talk about it, you'll see these graphics, and they surround the heart, and they're important because that's where a lot of the heart disease originates. And that's where they're looking for the soft plaque. Well, somebody like Dr. Budoff, or principal investigator, they're often called a reader at the point where they're looking through these CT angiograms in 3D. They're literally like zooming through, and it's kind of like following through these tunnels in your arteries virtually. And they have a total number of key locations. They're kind of like twists and turns where there's like a turn at, or where it bifurcates, it divides, where there's typically more likely plaque showing up than not.
Mm-hmm.
And so the score usually has a number of these, either like 45 or 60. And I think in the case of ours, I don't want to misspeak, but it's either 45 or 60, but let's pretend it's 45. Because more recently, I think it actually turns out that it's 60, but let's say that it's 45. There's a score that's given by the reader between 0 to 3 for each of these sites, each of these 15 sites.
Right.
0 means there's no plaque at all. A1 means it's very mild. A2 means it's medium. A3 means it's severe. So they're going through, they're basically ticking for each of these how much plaque there is.
Right.
And then at the end, they add all of those together. So with 15 sites, that means there's a number possible of between 0 and 45, because each of the 15 sites can be as much as 3, right? So my expectation, even before he's showing me this, as he's going through the classification, I'm going, okay, so we'll probably have, I'm guessing somewhere between 5 to 7 in the double digits that are in the medium, and probably like 3, maybe 4 that are closer into like the 30s or 40s.
Right.
And that's where the mic drop moment happened, because what happened was the next graph he showed, all of them were in the single digits. All of them had a total plaque score
of 9 or less.
Correct. Right. With most of them, Vinnie, being 0 in this population.
Wow.
Exactly. That was the reaction I had. Now, I want to immediately make sure that I emphasize anybody who's in our study who has like advanced calcification, obviously, they should be concerned. Obviously, if you have any plaque, that's, notable and of interest. But that said, that was wildly different than what my expectation was at a population level. And while I can't speak to the individual care that each person needs to consider for what they're in, I can say that this was news that was extremely motivating for me to change our roadmap. Our roadmap, and you and I talked about this offline for just a moment. We were going to wait until the second set of scans to then discuss whether we wanted to do what's known as a confirmatory study, as in, do we have novel enough data that we should consider doing a second study that would be considered, a sister study to this one. And I have to tell you, this baseline data has been strong enough, in my opinion, to then take this around to other doctors and researchers, which I have done in the last week and a half, to confirm I'm not crazy, to just go ahead and start a companion study now. And that's what's happening. Yours is actually the first podcast that I am talking about this on.
Wow.
That we are, in fact, right now. You have to know, I've gone through so much to get this first study done. And I was looking forward to the point where all 100 scans were completed, because I thought this next year would just be, a relaxing point.
Yeah.
But I have to tell you, I don't think we should wait at all. If there was any chance we were going to do a confirmatory study, which I definitely think that there is now, then I think we should go ahead and get started on instead a companion study that's going to run in parallel with this current study. And then that means in possibly as short as 2 years, we may have both studies fully completed and their analysis done, and both of those papers out there. Because as you know, one study can be groundbreaking.
Yeah.
But two studies, I mean, science is built on verification, right? And replication.
Yeah. Sure.
Why not just go ahead and move forward now?
Look, I couldn't agree more, because, what we have now and what we've been going with for the past 50 years has not worked. So if you guys have these studies and you can replicate it, boom. Here's my question, because the audience is sitting there going, "Hey, wait, I have a calcium score." Is there anything that you're aware of that can reverse a calcium score? Now, I'll throw some stuff out there. Vitamin E, topotrichol, not the tocopherol, has been shown to do something. People talk about magnesium. People talk about vitamin D. People talk about menaquinone 7, which is part of K2. Taking all these supplements. Any truth behind any of that? Any way to reverse a calcium score once you have it?
Well, in the groups, in the lean mass hyperresponder groups, this is a very popular topic. And to be sure, while I love CAC a lot, I do want to caution folks that, for one, it is relevant as to whether or not you've gone to the same machine at the same location and with the same technician who's looking through it, right? There's that. I think there's also variability that can come up in, you can kind of think of it as a bread slicer, right? The distance between each of the points of the scan are not super granular to the extent to where some of the calcification density
Wait,
can have some variability.
Dave, I don't mean to break in, but I've heard this.
Sorry.
Yeah. I've heard this before, where, people have gone and their scan had doubled in just a year, 2 years. And they go, how could it double? And, I've heard this theory before, that it could be the machine, the location, if the machine wasn't calibrated, if the machine was calibrated from the first time. So there's truth in that, is what you're telling me.
I think that there is, with recognition that I'm not an expert in this area and I don't put a lot of thought to it, but right. I'll put it this way. If you're coming to me and you have a CAC of 5, and then on your next scan it's 10, you're like, oh my gosh, it's doubled. It's certainly possible that it has doubled it, but for example, I already know that there's one person I know, for example, who's gotten several scans over, I want to say 7 years, something like that. And it's bounced around inside of that single digit number. And he himself is fairly convinced that it's just that variability I was just kind of getting into, right? But what I wouldn't expect is that kind of bouncing around between, say, 100 and 200. Then at those levels, you're less likely to have that bread slicing effect be as meaningful. So that kind of margin of error, that variability, that's hard to speak to, but it's worth bringing up when talking about regression. Because if somebody gets a scan and they have a 200, and then they report later that they had a 184, was that true regression, or is it possible that there was some variability in the capturing of the scan or between the machines, et cetera, right? Now, what I will say is, most of the folks who do seem to report that something positive happened, and again, I say this, take this with a grain of salt, because this is all very anecdotal. A commonality what's in the big Venn diagram, if you will, of the things I hear of what people try. The two things that come up the most are, of course, D3 and K2, vitamin D3 and vitamin K2. And I couldn't speak to the exact protocols that people use, but that does those two in particular seem to come up the most. And I wanted to do a case study on this, but Jamie Seaman, who is one of our speakers there at the at Low Carb Denver, had just told me that her husband actually saw, I'm not sure if I should even say it, but he had a sizable score that ultimately has just now come back as 0. And he was on a cocktail like this. And his score was sizable enough that I was like, okay, well, you need to turn this into a case study. And for what it's worth, I really think you should get a CT angiogram. And I think she's going to move forward on that. But I kind of don't want to rob her thunder in case she didn't want to reveal that just yet.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I had a guy, I can't remember the doctor's name. I was still recording out of California. It was way back then. I think he's passed away since. I want to say it was Dr. Bloom something. I can't remember. Bloomberg. I can't remember. This guy out of Hawaii. I remember certain things about people, and he was the first one that said, yeah, K2, metaquinone 7, metaquinone 4 and 7, MK4 and MK7. But he made a point to say MK7 can actually reverse this. Folks, what we're talking about is vitamin K comes in two forms. Vitamin K1, you get that from green, leafy greens, whatever. K2 comes from animal product, dairy and meat and everything else. And but K2 taken on its own, there's a lot of talk about. And under K2, there are two things. There's metaquinone 4 and metaquinone 7. There's probably other things there. I just don't know what they are. And they're saying that the metaquinone 7, the MK7, can actually reverse some of this. But you got to be on a cocktail of this stuff. It's not cheap. You're taking several hundred, I don't know, IUs or milligrams of, I'm not sure how metaquinone comes. It's probably an international unit. I do know, because I own a vitamin company, there's no UL on that, which means upper limit. So the federal government has never put a UL on K. So you can, the more K, the merrier. I would also tell you that if you're on any kind of blood thinners, you don't want to take extra K because you can bleed out. I don't know if people realize that. So you get, check with your doctor before you start taking a lot of metaquinone 4 or 7. At any rate, anything else like that, Dave, that we should be looking at? I should probably get this Dr. Jamie. What's her name? I don't even know her.
Jamie Seaman. She's great. She's fantastic. I think she's on Instagram as Dr. Fit and Fabulous. You'll really like her. She's
what kind of doctor
very
is
much OBGYN.
Can you make an introduction? Do you have her?
Sure.
Send me an email. We'll get her on. I'd like to talk to her about this. Talk to her, maybe even have her husband on at the same time. And but I need to talk to a good OBGYN. Don't ask me why. I got questions. I've been an amateur one my entire life. All right. I won't keep you forever, Dave. I want to ask you a couple of questions off the air, so don't go away. Folks, you know what to do. Oh, I don't want to forget to tell you guys right now at NSNG Foods, we have a 20% discount if you put in promo code Vinnie, 20% discount on the Ultra Fat. Go get it right now. Ultra Fat, 20% off, promo code Vinnie until the last day of March. Do not write to me and go, oh, I wanted to do it and I forgot. Go do it. Even if you get a subscription, the first time your subscription delivers, it'll be 20% off. And then it'll go to the low price of the subscription versus the one-time buy. So you can go do that at nsngfoods.com with the Ultra Fat. Dave, where can people find you?
Well, of course, we run the website, cholesterolcode.com, but I think a bit more frequently now, you can find a lot of our updates on citizensciencefoundation.org. That's the charity that's actually running these studies, and we'll probably have some more updates now. But I think my presence mostly is on Twitter at Real Dave Feldman. And of course, we also have if I can fit in the plug, we have a blood testing service, ownyourlabs.com. where people can privately own their blood work.
Go check out everything this guy's doing. I've been a big fan for a lot of years, so much so that I put him in my first movie. And the ladies were really digging that. He's a good-looking guy, so go check him out. Go before you go to Amazon, go to VinnieTortorich.com, click through the banner, puts a little coal in the fire, gets my train down the track. You can get that Nickel and Diamond Me PDF. That's the NSNG ebook for 10 small dollar bills. That's one run to Starbucks, folks. Even a half a run from what people are spending at Starbucks nowadays. So you can go check that out at VinnieTortorich.com. On behalf of Dave Feldman, my name is Vinnie Tortorich. Put life into living and do it with enthusiasm.